Hey there, everybody, and hello, Rick Hoeg from HoegLaw. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Destin. I'm happy to be here.
For those who don't know, you cover a lot of the video game space about legal stuff, and some of your background includes you're a Michigan business attorney, you have a decade of experience, legal expertise, and connections all in one accessible place on your
Oh my
website.
God.
You are one of the top 200 law firms on UpCounsel. And of course, virtual legality is probably what a lot of people know you from. Is there anything else I missed in your list of experience?
Oh no, that's a very nice list. Yeah, I mean, more than a decade is getting increasingly close to more than 2 decades, but we'll hold off on that for a couple of years yet. And then, yeah, I love doing this stuff. I love talking to people about business and law things that I see in the news and in popular culture that people maybe don't fully either understand or realize is happening behind the scenes. And since I love video games as much as I do, that's been the focal point for virtual legality for a long time now.
When I started covering the whole Activision thing, I think you were one of the first people I reached out to and said, "Hey, like I want to have a better understanding of what's going on here. Do you want to come on and chat about it for a little bit?" And you said yes. And, we had a conversation, and then fast forward a year later, and I really enjoy reading these legal documents. And I think everybody else seems to be catching on now that, oh, this is actually really interesting stuff. Have you noticed that also just in the games industry generally?
I think so, because I think by the time the FTC sues at the end of last year,
Mhm.
everybody realizes that this is a big kind of deal in our industry, but also just in general. Like you don't see these kinds of wars very often in the merger space or in the regulatory space. So this is one of those. It's very likely to have a Harvard business study done about it in the near future, and I think people are recognizing that day by day.
Yeah, it's been really cool to watch it all unfold, and I feel like I've learned a lot about the legal process and terms I hadn't heard of before, and it's been really fun from my end of things. Before we dive into the first question I asked everybody, I think some people are aware that you recently had some personal stuff, and do you want to share with the audience how you've been doing?
Sure. Well, today is the end of March here as we tape this. And about 3 months ago, I had a stroke, which was very unexpected, as you can imagine. And I've been recovering from that since. But rehab is going well. I do therapy twice a week now. And as you can hear from this video, I can talk pretty regularly and I can do what I was doing before, but maybe not at the volume I was doing it at. So I'm pretty happy with things. My therapists are pretty happy with things. But not gonna lie, that was not a fun top of 2023. I don't recommend it for anybody.
Yeah, I think everybody who knew what happened, we were all watching and hoping for the best to come out of it all. And you kind of kicked butt, and you're here today. You're doing your own thing again, and it's just awesome to have you back. You were really missed in the space, and it's really wonderful to see you doing content again. Where can people actually go support your stuff if they want to see what you do? Because I think you're one of the best people doing coverage of the merger.
That is very nice of you to say. So I am on YouTube primarily. So the channel is HoegLaw, HoegLaw. You can also look up virtual legality. That's where all the Microsoft times Activision stuff lives. But we've got support platforms at Patreon and at a upstart company called Utreon that's been very supportive of the channel for a number of years. They can check out. My wife and sister started a GoFundMe after I had my stroke. It's also very helpful for paying hospital bills and things, which are not insubstantial when you stay for a month. But anything anybody wants to do is fine with me. It's all great. Every little bit helps. A like button hit helps. So if you don't have money, you don't want to donate, that's totally fine. I never want anybody to feel obligated to do that. But my community has been so amazing. And my parents got to see everybody sent packages to my office while I was in the hospital. My dad had to take like 3 trips one day just to bring boxes in. And they all realized how cool my community is, how cool a lot of people on the internet are, and that's a big deal. It's fun to be able to tell your parents, hey, all that time I waste talking into a microphone at my computer, hey, people are actually listening to that occasionally.
Yeah.
So it's been a trying time, but also just a ton of positives. I've gotten to meet some of the best people I've ever met in my life, and my therapists and my nurses. So I can't recommend it.
Yeah.
Don't get a stroke. Don't do that. But if we can find silver linings even out of bad things, then I think that's a good step. So we try to do that here.
That's great. It's just wonderful to hear. Let's get back to legal talk now.
Yeah.
And the first question, I've done an interview with Pachter and Jaffe and Florian Mueller, and now you. The first question I ask everybody: do you think the Activision deal goes through?
Yes.
Okay. You want to
In some
elaborate?
form or fashion, it's going through. Yes. Well, I still suspect that various entities in Europe are going to ask for concessions at least. And by that, I just mean that they're going to ask for Microsoft to agree to a certain way of doing things for a period of time. Not that they're going to divest or structurally change Microsoft. But I do think that they're going to ask for concessions and they're going to get some. Microsoft has signaled now for almost a year or more than a year at this point that they're willing to do certain things, like enter into agreements with certain parties in the video game space to put Call of Duty on those platforms. And I think they might be asked to do that as a legal mandate in the future, but that will still allow the deal to go through. That's what we call a behavioral remedy.
How surprised were you with sort of the flip that the CMA did very recently? You did a whole video about it, and to you, does that indicate that they're leaning towards approval? I know there's still the cloud issue to take a look at, but I mean, that was pretty surprising to have such a big turn in terms of their perspective on the merger.
Well, I would say I was surprised when the FTC and the CMA originally came out with some of their reasoning to start out with. But yes, anytime a regulator takes a very public position that was pretty staunchly advocated for in the very recent past and then says, nah, sorry about that, that's surprising. And one of the things I said in my video was there's always a kind of impulse to say, oh, what are you doing? You're flipping, you're flopping. And I want to push that down. I want to say we want regulators to reconsider their positions. And we want them to be able to say, you know what, we think we got that part wrong. Let's look at it again. So I'm entirely in favor of the CMA or the FTC or the European Commission or anybody else looking at things again and saying, we think we have a better understanding now. Let's reanalyze that situation. So it was a surprise, but one that I think everybody that follows these kinds of things, follows antitrust in general, looks at how regulators operate, should be happy with. It is a good thing for them to go and say, this is where the evidence points, rather than to just lock down and say, we don't want to be embarrassed by what our phase one preliminary findings were.
And then in addition to the CMA sort of changing their stance, I believe it was like a day or two ago, the Japan Federal Trade Commission, I believe it's Federal Trade Commission, something like that. The Japan area approved the deal without concessions. Pardon?
Yeah, I was just saying the regulators in Japan. Everybody has different names for all these things, right? When Brazil came out with theirs and theirs was CADE, it's like, okay, that's fine. You just have to try to remember a bunch of different letters for all the different countries. But yeah, Japan approved. And of course, the Japan story is part of another interesting large story that I may wind up doing a video on, which is that the US and Japan are invested right now in trade negotiations. And so our delegation has started to use the high-end video game console market definition that the FTC used to bring their complaint, their administrative action against the deal, as proof that Sony's operating as a monopoly in Japan. Now, the definition, which I put in air quotes here, is not a good one. It's one of the reasons the FTC's case is so weak. But as we have seen here, the real politic of these various bodies and politicians, of course, who are our delegates to talking about this trade agreement, want to use whatever statistic best helps them push whatever position they're trying to push over the edge. And so if they've got a definition that says Nintendo doesn't count and Sony owns 98% of the market, we see their willingness to use that. I don't love that as a lover of truth and reality, rather than a politician on either side of any of these questions. And so I look at that and say, you can't just ignore Nintendo's operations in Japan. That's crazy talk. But that's what's happening right now. And some people on the internet, as you've probably seen, like the whole petard hoisting aspect of that, with Sony advocating so staunchly for that definition of two players in the console market. And so I think there's a lot of stuff going on, which isn't exactly covering the political or regulatory processing glory. And so that always bugs me as a lawyer, as a lover of law and structures here, because I do think that has a weakening effect on people's belief that any of these systems are operating properly.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. So Japan approved it without concessions, but now we have these, United States senators and I believe some Congress people reaching out to the JFTC saying, hey, maybe you should take a little bit closer look at Sony. Sony set up the definition of the high-end console market, which, puts them and Microsoft head to head. It eliminates Nintendo, which we both agree is absolutely ridiculous. Nintendo has a huge market share in Japan. But when you start looking at their own definition of the high-end console market, it's 98 and 2. Has Sony set themselves up for a little bit of trouble here with this situation?
I think Sony definitely did set themselves up when they started to so staunchly agree with what the FTC and the CMA were doing, which is already a pretty aggressive position in order to justify their findings at the time with respect to the CMA and with the FTC continuing. I think that they have set themselves up to be closely examined for how they operate in a number of different jurisdictions, not the least of which is Japan. Because if it is just Sony versus Microsoft, Sony obviously has the bulk of huge markets in and across a bunch of jurisdictions. And so if you ask regulators to really look at that carefully, you start to get questions about, should we be allowing exclusive contracts and marketing deals for somebody that owns huge percentages of the marketplace against Xbox? So I think they've set themselves up for that a little bit. I don't love that because I think the definition is silly in all cases, regardless of which side you fall on for the deal or things like Sony marketing various programs. But I do think that they have helped find themselves in this position with the stances that they took with the FTC and the CMA. And so I understand the internet and irony-loving video game fans all over the place saying, well, this is what they've sowed, right? Or they're reaping it now.
Yeah. We've all seen the memes.
So I understand it. I still want to see reality win out, which is that Sony is not a monopoly provider of video game access in Japan.
If you've watched this far and you like the content, please hit the subscribe button, hit the bell if you have not yet, especially if you like this sort of stuff, because I talk about it all the time. If you're already subscribed, hit the like button, because that does help YouTube recognize that, hey, people like this, and share it further. Let's get back to the interview, though. Another conversation that I've seen a lot online were about the lobbyists. So we know that Sony has lobbyists. We know Microsoft has many more lobbyists because they're a $1 trillion company, and Sony's what, billion? Yeah, they're in the billions, right? And I'm curious, do you think there's any truth to the idea that the senators and the Congress people were given the nudge by Microsoft to make this play after Sony so staunchly went against Microsoft with their own lobbyists in Washington?
I'd say the really short answer is yes. Microsoft is clearly having an effect on some of these talks. Whether or not that is a nudge, a phone call, an email, or just their existence in the jurisdiction that these Congress people find themselves in is open to interpretation, because you know who your constituents are, you know who your big money donors are. You don't need to be told, hey, it would be nice if we advocated for this position. So I think that sometimes people get a little conspiratorial, and they don't need to get that conspiratorial, because you don't actually have to have a red phone directly to your senator saying, do this, in order to get that done if you're Microsoft. So I do think Microsoft and their existence and their money has had an effect, but probably not as direct as some people on the internet think.
Yeah. And also when you start calculating the state representative for Washington over 30 years received about, I'm guessing off the top of my head here, but it was like $536,000 over 30 years. That's like $17,000 a year. Washington, I believe, has disclosure rules about where your donations come from and the places those people work. So I don't think, I mean, yeah, sure, people can come to their own conclusions, but I don't think $17,000 a year is particularly remarkable in terms of campaign donations.
Well, the other aspect of that, from a lobbying perspective, from money and politics perspective, is that I think what people really get upset about is the concept that somebody was going to not do something or do something differently and that money changed their mind. Very often, what that Microsoft money is, what any corporate money is instead of changing people's mind, it's getting the people in position that already agree with you, right? You already have somebody that's slanted towards our side of things, and we put them in that seat, which is probably a lot closer to what's happening than we called you up and we put $50,000 in a bag outside your door. That's less likely to be happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what did I have next here? Do you think the industry is going to see changes given all this new interest in the gaming sector? And is that good or bad? There's a lot of talk about how third parties being exclusives are negative, and I'm starting to wonder, is this actually going to have a longer term impact on the industry? Because now Washington's very interested in what's going on in the gaming market.
Yeah, I think if you go back into my playlist on this, you'll hear me refer to the regulatory look here as the Eye of Sauron. So when Sony starts really arguing for their point with the FTC, one of the questions I raise is, you don't really want this level of heat on the video game industry, because everything under a microscope is always going to be reevaluated by regulators or other authorities. So the answer to that is, I don't know long term, but I think it's more likely than it was before all this started. And I think that's from Sony and Microsoft clashing so strongly. Anytime you see this kind of action and you wind up with these numbers like 98% or 90%, or even a two-party market is a little bit scary or fraught for regulators in general, I think you're going to wind up inviting them into your door. And yeah, maybe you get another look at, should exclusives on marketing agreements be allowed at all? Personally, my position is that they are not anti-competitive, and that they are the way that you compete at the console level with downstream products, right? So I want Sony and the PlayStation line and Microsoft the Xbox line to go get exclusives to fight with each other, because I think that that level of console fighting is good for competition. It's good for consumers long term.
Yeah.
We want a strong Sony, we want a strong Microsoft, and we want them to clash. We want them to fight for our attention.
Mm-hmm.
But you could easily spin that around the other way and say, well, if somebody succeeds too much, like Sony or somebody else, that those are restraints of trade. And one of the big problems we have in American antitrust, and this is really global, is that the antitrust laws are very, very broad. So the Sherman Antitrust Act says it's illegal to have a restraint of trade. But we know that that's not actually true, right? You can sign an employment agreement that says, I'm not going to work for your competitor at the same time that you're paying me. You can sign all sorts of things that are technically restraints, but those are deemed to be okay restraints. We need that to function as an economy and a society. Where we get into problems is that the court then has to interpret it for every new industry and every new age. Say what we really are against are anti-competitive, unfair restraints of trade. And what does that look like? Is an exclusive marketing agreement that says we're the only ones that are going to be able to get beta access to Resident Evil 4, whatever it might be. Is that something that is illegal? Is it anti-competitive to the extent that it forces out Microsoft and Nintendo? I would argue no, but when you have people re-looking at these things and people that are already kind of anti-technology company, you could easily have that question go the other direction, and then suddenly a whole business model is out the window, right? If Sony's looking at this realistically, one of their big fears that keeps them awake at night is that everything that they've done to build their brand in the last 20 years could be looked at as something that they're not allowed to do anymore. Do I think that's likely? No, but I don't think that they should be just saying that that's impossible with this level of interest in their operations in the video game industry overall.
Yeah, this whole letter to the JFTC, to me, I'm just like, oh, things are going to happen. Like, this is the start of a deeper look at the industry. So I find your perspective really interesting. And I didn't know you said that back when the whole thing started, like, hey, maybe you don't want to stir up the hornet's nest too much, because, you know, now Washington's kind of looking for their next success story, right? And potentially it could be leveling the playing field in a way that Sony does not like.
That was one of the areas where I was just most surprised with Sony's adamance, right? By the time they flip over to this deal cannot be allowed if the video game industry is to survive, I'm like, well, you're biting off a lot there. And Sony went all in on that. Now, I think some of that is coming back on them, but overall, I just think you don't want, if you're Sony, if you are the market leader, you don't want a high level of regulatory scrutiny on your operations. And I think to some extent that is going to happen. But I don't know what the appetite is for that. We're obviously in a very interesting economy right now, and there's a lot of things that are going to demand legislature's focuses here and abroad. So Sony might be hoping that they're just not that interesting over the long term. But I do think if I'm Sony, I'm sitting there a little bit worried that the entire government apparatus might decide that the way they operate is wrong.
On that note, do you think that the FTC case is going to go through? There's a lot of requests for documents from Microsoft. There's a lot of requests for documents from Sony now. I personally, to somebody that's been creating content about this, I cannot wait to see those documents come to light. But I do think the case will be dropped, and I'd be curious to hear what you think. Do you think the case goes through, or is there something larger at play here? And I'll talk about that in a second.
So again, if you have watched any of my coverage of this, I was surprised to see them bring the case because it's so weak. in historical kind of precedents. But that being said, the same reason that it's weird to bring when it's weak means that it isn't obvious that they drop it when it's just a little bit weaker, right? So if the FTC continues on without the CMA and the European Commission backing them up, it wouldn't surprise me. But it also wouldn't surprise me to say, hey, we're reconsidering and this is going to be a bad loss for us. So I think overall, what we're looking at is a Federal Trade Commission that's very difficult to predict because they have exhibited a certain kind of desire to bring cases, whether or not they have the strength to win them in federal court or not. So I agree with everybody that has said, hey, when the CMA drops this, as it looks like they might, or when the European Commission comes out on Microsoft's side of this, does the FTC just say, you know what? We don't have a case. We're not bringing it anymore. We don't want to look bad. I think ordinarily, if you looked at this historically, you would say, yes, in general, they would reflect on it and say this isn't worth our time. But this FTC, this current body in American jurisprudence, I think might just decide, let's bring it and lose. Even if we lose, we can say the laws aren't sufficient to handle what they need to be. And so we're going to use that as marketing platform for the next thing we want to do. So I can see it both ways. If I were in the Federal Trade Commission right now, if I were in charge, I would be dropping this. I wouldn't have brought it in the first place, but I'm not. I know much to people's happiness sometimes, but I'm not the head of the Federal Trade Commission, and so it wouldn't surprise me either direction on this. Now, in terms of the documents, I can totally understand wanting to see some information leaked out, as happened with respect to Epic and Apple. But I think chances are, because this is an internal administrative action, they'd be a little bit better at controlling their information flow anyway. So I think we'd probably both get cross-eyed from the level of redactions and snips out of the information that we really want to see from those documents. So I don't think huge amounts of value are lost with the FTC dropping their case. I do think it's interesting to see both Sony and Microsoft kind of demur at the requests that are being made on the documents. That's been fun to watch because they're fighting each other in what I consider a normal discovery process, which is you ask for the moon, the other party refuses, you try to look a little bit more considerate, and then ultimately you complain to the parents, the court, when they don't give you the documents that you want. And that happened both directions.
Yeah.
So I think both Microsoft and Sony are doing what I would expect in a litigation context. So I don't really hold either of them particularly in anger on what they've been operating on there, but I'm a lawyer, so I've seen these kind of fights before. Ultimately, I think the FTC is not going to win its case, so I'm not that worried about it, but I am interested in seeing whether Microsoft would close over it, which is, as I described in my video, a phrase that I use to explain what happens when a condition isn't met in an agreement. So right now we have a merger agreement that's been signed between Microsoft and Activision, right? And in that merger agreement, there are a number of conditions to closing. That's why all the headlines from a year ago that say Microsoft has purchased Activision are wrong.
Yeah.
So that doesn't happen until you actually close the deal. But in those conditions to closing, there will be things like there isn't a pending litigation. All the regulators have given their approval, or otherwise the time period has passed where they can deny approval, as is the case in the United States, because the FTC and the DOJ don't give approval for deals. So that would be a condition of closing. With a pending FTC action set for August, if it's not dropped, Microsoft wouldn't have to close, but the parties can decide to close anyway. They can close over a lack of a met condition. And Microsoft has indicated to the FTC that they will do that. But as I've said on my side of the internet, one thing you have to keep in mind when you're looking at a litigation, as is the case here, is that you have a lot of incentives to say things, maybe not for their truth value, but to move parties in various directions. And so it's very useful for Microsoft to say, we're going to close regardless of what you do, FTC, to encourage the FTC to go fast, right? To get their stuff done, to answer discovery requests, and to keep moving forward, so that the FTC is worried that if the European Union and the United Kingdom approve the deal, that they'll just move through with it, and the FTC would have to go and try to seek a federal injunction. So will Microsoft ultimately do that? I don't know. Whether they'll close over this deal or not, I really can't say, because I know if I'm in charge of Microsoft, which again, many of you can be very happy I'm not, I would probably not close over a pending FTC action, because I'd be concerned about the cost and logistics value of the FTC actually ultimately winning and deciding that I have to divest of what I just purchased. So I wouldn't close over that. I think in most cases, a corporation wouldn't close over a regulator suing them to stop their deal. But Microsoft has indicated that they will, so we can't just ignore that.
Microsoft's also nearing their $3 billion deadline, which is the max amount for the deal falling apart, basically, right? That they would have to pay Activision. That's like in April, right? So I don't think Microsoft's going to drop this. Do you? Like, they're already at $2.5 billion. What's another 500 million at this point?
Yeah, I think the exit ramps were really, once this happens from the FTC at the end of last year, one of the question marks I had is the FTC trying to force them off at the $2 billion level, which I think was the middle of January.
Mm-hmm.
Once they pass that, and there's no indication that they're going to do any of that, I don't think that the FTC can force them out of the deal. So Microsoft, I don't see them exiting in the April deadline. I think they're just going to move forward. And every indication they've given to us in the public is that they're going to close regardless of the status of the FTC action. I don't know how realistic that is or not, but it certainly suggests that they want us to believe they don't think the FTC has a leg to stand on.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there is a bill that I've seen some people talking about, S3847, Prohibiting Anti-Competitive Mergers Act of 2022. Basically,
the $5 billion one?
The $5 billion mergers wouldn't be allowed to happen. So Sony wouldn't be able to acquire Bungie. Activision wouldn't be able to be acquired by Microsoft. It's basically any deal over $5 billion. Is that the thing that you think the FTC is trying to work towards building the platform for?
I think the FTC would love that. I think that's part of, if you look at Lena Khan's background, she wrote a paper suggesting that a certain size of merger shouldn't be allowed. I think in the context of Amazon, if I'm remembering that correctly. But yeah, I think that's something that they're invested in long term. I don't think this deal should turn on that. And ultimately, I don't know that it would pass muster in the court system to just have a number out there that says this is somehow something that shouldn't be allowed. That's not me, again, not on the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. But those are the questions that you'd have to ask long term. Could Congress just put a number out there and say you can't combine at this level? Certainly that would lower the value of a lot of assets of a lot of multi-billion-dollar corporations immediately. Whether that happens is going to be up to the legislature. In my opinion, I think that the FTC would love to see that kind of power, but I don't know that they'll ultimately get it. And I don't know that this helps their case.
Do you think with all this heat and all these things happening now, Sony's being looked at, the JFTC is diving into stuff, do you think PlayStation is going to sign a deal? And what advantage at this point is there to Sony not signing the deal?
Well, I think the advantage Sony can get right now is that they're continuing to bet on something better coming along from the regulatory process, right? I mean, like, that's what they were betting on before. That's what they're betting on now if they were to not sign. From signing, you get obviously the certainty of having access to whatever intellectual property you're trying to get access to, presumably Call of Duty, on your platform for the foreseeable future. But I can see Sony balking at whatever it might view as unfair economic terms. That's what they've continued to present to the regulators and to us in the public. And we don't really get to see those economic terms so much because they're redacted out of all the reports that we get. So Sony can just be trying to leverage cleanliness in the deal-making process right now against Microsoft as part of negotiating those terms in a deal behind the scenes, right? So if they're asking for some huge price that Sony doesn't want to pay, they say, well, we'll sign it if we get to a lower price. And then Microsoft can breathe easy with them finally being signed out, because presumably neither the FTC nor the CMA are going to get very far with their actions once Sony PlayStation is actually signed up to a deal like this. So they're basically trying to leverage each other as to the cleanliness of the deal and working with these regulators in the future. If I'm Sony, I'm sitting in these boardrooms saying, I don't think we're going to win the day here from the regulatory process. But if the deal is bad enough, there's no point in signing it. And we just can't judge that for ourselves from the outside.
Yeah, I have to wonder like what it is. I guess they really just don't want to lose those exclusive beta weekends or, timed exclusive map skins.
Well, my understanding is they have a bit of a sweetheart deal on the 70-30 split.
Yeah.
With Activision that they were worried about losing. And of course they're worried about just having more strength in the Xbox brand, because that can spin around on them in a number of different ways.
Primarily, do you think Sony is the reason that there's been so much regulatory hubbub about the deal?
To some extent. I mean, I think one of the things that has happened is that we found ourselves in a place where a lot of regulators are willing to try to make their mark against technology companies. And even though that usually is aimed right now at Apple and Google and Amazon and things that are in front of Congress more often than Microsoft, Microsoft still bears the the concept of being a big tech company that's had prior anti-regulatory issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Microsoft came up on the top line, and they were always going to get a look that maybe they didn't deserve for a deal of this type in the video game industry, which is a dynamic industry with a lot of players. But I think Sony coming in as harshly as they did, once you started to see their responses in places like Brazil and the CMA, that gave the regulators a kind of foothold to say there's a market participant that thinks this will destroy them, and we can use that as the background for our arguments against it. So I think Sony plays a critical part, but those that say that it's Sony to blame for this, I think are probably giving them too much credit, because it's the regulators ultimately that have to decide on these things. And ultimately, they're getting a whole lot of information from a bunch of different market participants. And they had to choose to take Sony's position and make it the standard that they were going to bring their action on. So Sony gave that arrow in the quiver to these regulators, but the regulators had to be the ones that ultimately decided to fire them.
Interesting. There's a few other locations where this still has to be approved. New Zealand and Samar in China. I believe those are the only two that I have listed. Do you see any issues arising with any of the other locations?
No, I think the UK, the European Union, and the US are the big ones that remain. And I do think that most of the smaller jurisdictions will follow the lead of what happens there. Now, I know that Microsoft has indicated both in the pre-hearing testimony in respect to the FTC and in other cases that they're trying to get a concession set that'll work for all of these various places. Presumably Microsoft would just offer that to anybody else that decided to make hay at all, because they just don't have as much sway, because they don't have as much market presence as these much bigger, larger markets for the Xbox and Activision ecosystems. So generally speaking, you identify the big jurisdictions that you're worried about, like Microsoft has done, and then the littler ones will fall into line with what those bigger ones decide to do. Could there be somebody that just decides to be crazy? Yes, but Microsoft can do things to isolate or otherwise pull out of various markets.
So similar to how they're handing out 10-year Call of Duty deals to basically anybody who will sign, it sounds like they could also just be like, well, here's your concessions package. Everybody else has agreed to it. Would you like it also?
Yeah, give or take. And we'll fight you if you don't take it. And if we leave New Zealand, the people that are going to be pissed are your constituents.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I mean, like that's what that looks like long term. Said a little bit more, eruditely, with a little bit more bourbon, perhaps, on a phone call. But no, it's going to be Microsoft winning the three big jurisdictions, if that's how it goes, and then the other jurisdictions will probably follow suit. You saw this in various other places already across the world. So that's what I would expect. We still have open questions as to what the CMA does with cloud services, what the European Union does at all, and whether the FTC continues their action. But I think things are trending very positively towards the deal getting done. I think you've also seen that reflected in the stock market price for Activision.
Yeah. So just for my own curiosity, say New Zealand says, no, we're not going to let the deal go through. Everywhere else approves it. What does Microsoft do? They're just like, all right, you're never going to have Call of Duty in New Zealand.
It's actually a little worse for that for Microsoft because they're a big conglomerate. So, I mean, it could be as much as Windows. It really depends on what the country would require of them. But yes, there are ways to just say, okay, if you say that this company as combined is not allowed to operate within your jurisdiction, then we won't operate within your jurisdiction. And we care about the United Kingdom. We care about the US. We care about Europe. We don't care about New Zealand, or we don't care about this province in whereversville, right? So you have to evaluate these things as they happen. But right now, I think Microsoft is probably and rightly assuming that if they get the big ones done, then the little ones will follow suit.
Okay. There was one recent story, and this is the last one I had for you. How do you feel about the recent I believe it was NetEase story, where Kotick is rumored to have been threatened? So we pulled the deal. Basically, somebody at the company in question said, hey, we're going to go to the government of China and basically say either to let the deal go through or to squash the deal. Do you have any reaction to that story?
My reaction is that it's very possible in high-end negotiations to say those kinds of things, and that the reaction as described in the stories that I saw makes sense from the Activision perspective. But I do know that at the time the story happened, because I reported on this as well, there were mentions of a misunderstanding causing such damage to a relationship of this type. And I do think you can get caught in translation issues across time zones and things like that when you have these kinds of conversations. So I don't know NetEase well enough to know whether the individual in question would have made such a threat. It seems possible to me, but it is also possible that they said it would, the equivalent of the mafia version of wouldn't it be a shame if something happened to this store, but when through a translator becomes much more direct by the time it comes back in English, right? I can
Yeah.
understand both situations. Certainly, if I felt like the other side in a contract dispute were threatening to go to regulators and blow up a $70 billion deal that was going to get both me out of the business and make my stockholders a lot of money,
Mhm.
I would take that pretty darn seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought it was interesting. Like, I'm not a huge fan of Bobby Kotick myself
Sure.
and a lot of the practices, but if somebody said to me basically, hey, we're going to sway the government one way or another, I mean, I can kind of understand why it got pulled, and it got pretty nasty with comments like calling obviously Bobby Kotick a big jerk, or at least alluding to somebody at Activision, and statues being torn down. So yeah, that whole thing was interesting and kind of nasty by the end of it, honestly.
Big money deals can get nasty. There's no question there.
Yeah. Rick, any other thoughts about the deal? I don't really have any other questions for you, but it's been great chatting with you again.
Oh, absolutely. No, I love following this, as you can tell.
Yeah.
I think that there's going to be a few more twists and turns before we get to the finish line here, much to some people's chagrin, I'm sure. But I do think this deal is pretty likely to go through. And I think at that point, we can move on to looking at other deals that'll be announced later on this year. That would be my guess for the industry. It's definitely an era of consolidation.
Yeah, you think more consolidation will be happening in the near future,
Oh,
huh?
yeah.
Any
Yeah,
companies in particular?
I think we've seen kind of a breath, a pause, because Microsoft can't really move with this pending, and Sony doesn't have near as much cash as Microsoft does. So I think we'll continue to see acquisitions of various types. And my sincere hope is that Microsoft really gets its pipeline management together and really starts to have big
Yes.
products come out of their intellectual property, because people wrongly think that I'm just some huge Xbox fan that's super stoked about deals like this. I want to see money in the industry, so I am excited about that. But I'm certainly as cautious or as cautiously optimistic as other people on the internet have been, which is to say, Microsoft now has a huge number of historically important legacy intellectual properties and a
Mhm.
huge number of development studios. And I want to see that begin to have a more robust cadence of releases. I don't think Microsoft um, doesn't understand that that is a current issue with what they're putting together. So I'm hopeful that that continues to be something that they focus on. But certainly, I want to see them get better at it because I like video games and I want to see more of that intellectual property and video games come to light.
Absolutely agree with you. The release cadence has been spotty at best, and the quality has been everything from like Forza Horizon 5, which is excellent, to Crossfire X last year, which was not excellent, to put it mildly. Yeah, it's been all over the place, and they own Fallout, one of my favorite franchises ever. So I'm like, don't mess up those IPs that I love, you know? Thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate you joining me today. One more time, anything you want to plug before we go? Where can people find your stuff?
Oh no, yeah, my stuff is on the YouTube channel at HoegLaw, which people can absolutely check out. I am planning on doing a stroke video or series of videos pretty soon for anybody interested in my experience, because I think it has been pretty eye-opening, both for my age, which is relatively young. I'm not a spring chicken or anything, but I'm relatively young to have the stroke that I had, and what rehabilitation means, like what my therapy is, what that actually looks like for people that are either going through the same thing or worried about it, and what it looks like if you do wind up going through that. So I want to have those videos up on my channel pretty soon. My cadence of video making is not quite what it was before all this happened, so that'll be probably sometime in April. But check out the channel. We've got a long playlist on Microsoft times Activision. I think it's 60 videos now.
Wow.
You could listen to it and put yourself to sleep for days. Come on by, absolutely.
I look forward to every new video you post. I usually watch them if I'm in the car or just walking around the house carrying one of the babies.
Just listening if you're in the car.
Oh no, you can't like watch it in the car. Obviously, I put it face down. That's the law, right? Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for watching. We'll catch you for the next one.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching, everybody. If you like that video, please consider hitting the subscribe button, hitting the bell. If you're already subscribed, hit the like button right now to show that you like the videos that I make. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much to the members for supporting the channel. Members, you support at any level, you get all the videos without ads. And I just want to say a big thank you to all of these fine people who support the channel. It really, really means a lot. If you want to become a member, you can click that join button right down there. Now, if you want to see some of my other interviews, the one I did before this was with David Jaffe. Thank you so much, Jaffe, for joining me. And I've done them with Florian Mueller and Michael Pachter, and we'll see who else will actually chat with me and go from there. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I'll catch you for the next one. Bye for now.